January 7th, 1945. The air inside the Supreme Allied headquarters in Versailles was thick with cigarette smoke and an almost suffocating tension. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone at his massive desk, a single document before him. It was a transcript of a press conference given just hours earlier by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. As Eisenhower read the words, his hands began to shake. This was not a tremor of fear. Eisenhower had faced enemy fire, political intrigue, and the weight of the free world on his shoulders without flinching. This was a tremor of pure, unadulterated rage. Montgomery, the commander of the British 21st Army Group, had just stood before the world press and effectively claimed that he, and he alone, had saved the American army from total annihilation during the Battle of the Bulge. The British Field Marshal's words painted a picture of American incompetence that was as vivid as it was false. He described arriving at the front to find the Americans in a state of utter disarray, leaderless and panicked, confused amidst the snow and blood. He claimed that he had personally taken command, imposed British discipline upon the chaos, and organized the defensive lines that finally halted the German offensive. To any layman reading the transcript, it sounded as though American generals had lost their nerve, American soldiers had broken rank, and only the steady hand of British leadership had prevented a complete and catastrophic disaster on the Western Front. Every sentence was a calculated insult. Every claim was a distortion of reality. Eisenhower had held the title of Supreme Allied Commander since 1943. He had orchestrated the invasion of North Africa, managed the bloody campaign in Sicily, and commanded the colossal D-Day landings at Normandy. His job was arguably the most difficult in military history. He had to coordinate armies from multiple sovereign nations, balance the fragile egos of prima donna generals, and keep Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, the three most powerful men on earth, reasonably satisfied, all while fighting a war against the Nazi war machine. He had managed the most complex logistical and military operation in human history, and now, his direct subordinate, British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, had just publicly humiliated him and the entire United States Army. Montgomery had not just taken credit. He had stolen the valor of men who had died in the freezing forests of the Ardennes. He stood in front of reporters and claimed ownership of victories won by American blood, grit, and sacrifice. He implied, with that distinct air of British superiority, that without his intervention, the Americans would have lost the Battle of the Bulge, and quite possibly, the war itself. Eisenhower knew Montgomery well enough to know this was not a slip of the tongue. The press conference wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a translation error or a misunderstanding. Montgomery knew exactly what he was doing. He was positioning himself for the history books as the savior of the Western Front. He was crafting a narrative where he was the solitary military genius who had rescued incompetent American cowboys from their own tactical failures. Eisenhower put down the transcript, the paper crinkling under his grip, and picked up the secure telephone. He needed to speak to his senior American commanders immediately. The situation was critical. Why? Because if he didn't do something about Montgomery right now, if he didn't silence this insubordination, his own commanders were going to resign in protest. And if generals like Bradley and Patton resigned, the American public would turn against the war, the alliance would collapse, and the crusade against Hitler might be lost at the 11th hour. This was the terrifying moment Dwight Eisenhower discovered the paradox of his position. Being Supreme Allied Commander meant having absolute authority over millions of men, except for the one subordinate who needed to be fired the most. To understand why this moment was so explosive, one must look back to October 1942. The setting was the scorching sands of North Africa. Bernard Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army at the pivotal Battle of El Alamein. For 2 long, humiliating years, British forces had been pushed back and forth across the desert by German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. The British people were starving for a victory. They had lost battles, lost vast swathes of territory, and perhaps most dangerously, lost confidence in their own military capability. Then, Montgomery arrived like a storm. Montgomery was different. He was methodical, precise, and unyielding. He spent weeks preparing for El Alamein, refusing to be rushed by politicians in London. He stockpiled massive amounts of supplies, drilled his troops relentlessly, and planned every minute detail of the offensive. When he finally unleashed his attack on October 23, 1942, the result was decisive. He broke through Rommel's defensive lines, shattered the Afrika Korps, and sent the German forces into a headlong retreat. It was the first major, undeniable British victory against the German army, and it transformed Montgomery from a general into a demigod. Overnight, he became a national celebrity. Winston Churchill, desperate for good news, called El Alamein the turning point of the war and famously said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Church bells, silent since 1939, rang out across Britain in celebration. Montgomery's photograph appeared on every newspaper front page from London to Edinburgh. He became synonymous with British military competence, a symbol of resurrection after years of defeats and humiliations. The British public didn't just respect him, they adored him. He was eccentric, which the public loved. He was quotable. He wore 2 military badges on his black beret instead of the Regulation 1, a visual trademark of his defiance. He didn't smoke or drink, living a monastic life dedicated to the art of war. He gave inspiring, biblical speeches about British determination and fighting spirit. He projected absolute, unshakable confidence, which was exactly what Britain desperately needed after the miracle of Dunkirk, the fall of France, and the terror of the Blitz. But there was a dark side to this adulation. Montgomery began to believe his own press. He believed completely in his own singular genius. He thought he was the greatest military mind, not just of the war, but of the generation. He wrote in his private diary that most other generals were incompetent amateurs, that politicians were fools who didn't understand warfare, and that he alone possessed the secret knowledge of how to win battles through careful preparation and methodical execution. This confidence hardened into a brittle, dangerous arrogance. Montgomery started to believe that his judgment was infallible, a gift from the divine. Anyone who disagreed with his tactical views was either stupid, jealous, or obstructing victory. He stopped listening to intelligence that contradicted his preconceived notions. Crucially, he began treating American generals not as allies, but as well-meaning amateurs who required firm British guidance to avoid getting themselves killed. This attitude would sow the seeds of the crisis that would nearly destroy the Allied command in 1945. By the time 1945 arrived, Montgomery had been promoted to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the British Army. He commanded the massive 21st Army Group, comprising the bulk of British and Canadian forces in Northwest Europe. On paper, the chain of command was clear, he reported to Eisenhower. In practice, however, Montgomery considered himself Eisenhower's equal and in matters of strategy, his superior. Everyone in the high command knew that firing Montgomery was the nuclear option. It would create a political crisis of such magnitude that it could fracture the Anglo-American alliance permanently. Eisenhower's position as Supreme Allied Commander was fundamentally political, not just military. This is a crucial distinction. He wasn't just moving chess pieces on a map. He was commanding armies from sovereign nations with different governments, different military traditions, conflicting post-war goals, and different political pressures. His primary job was to keep everyone working together while winning the war. This meant making endless compromises that pure military logic would never require. Consider the numbers. By 1945, the British contributed roughly 25% of the forces in Western Europe. The Americans contributed most of the rest, with smaller but vital contingents from Canada, France, Poland, and other nations. By sheer weight of numbers, the Americans should have dictated every strategy. But Britain insisted on having influence proportional to its historical prestige and its sacrifice, not just its current force contribution. Churchill made this point repeatedly and forcefully. Britain was a great power. The British Empire spanned the globe. British forces had been fighting Germany alone since 1939 while America sat on the sidelines. Churchill demanded that British commanders be treated as full equals to Americans, regardless of how many divisions they actually fielded. This created a delicate, agonizing balance for Eisenhower. He had to show proper respect for British contributions and British commanders, even when military efficiency suggested concentrating authority with American generals like Bradley, who led much larger forces. He had to consult with Montgomery, coordinate with Montgomery, and publicly praise Montgomery, whether he wanted to or not. Why? Because Churchill personally backed Montgomery in every single dispute. Whenever Eisenhower and Montgomery clashed on strategy, which was often, Churchill would intervene on Montgomery's behalf. He would write directly to President Roosevelt, argue with the combined chiefs of staff, and use every political tool in his arsenal to protect his favorite general. The structure of the combined chiefs of staff reinforced this deadlock. Major strategic decisions required approval from both American and British military leadership. If Eisenhower fired Montgomery without Churchill's explicit approval, Churchill could appeal to Roosevelt and the combined chiefs, turning a military personnel decision into an international diplomatic crisis. Roosevelt had made it crystal clear to Eisenhower: maintaining the alliance mattered more than military perfectionism. The Americans and British had to stay united to defeat Germany and then confront the looming shadow of the Soviet Union. Personal disputes between generals, no matter how bitter, couldn't be allowed to fracture that unity. Eisenhower's orders were paradoxical: win the war, but keep Churchill happy. So, even though Eisenhower was supreme Allied commander with theoretical authority over all forces, he couldn't exercise that authority freely when it came to Montgomery. Firing the British national hero would offend Churchill, enrage the British public who saw Monty as their savior, and potentially cause political problems that could harm the war effort more than Montgomery's continued presence. Eisenhower understood this trap from the beginning. He told his staff that he had to get along with Montgomery, whether he liked him or not. He said the alliance mattered more than his personal feelings. He would smile at Montgomery's arrogance, tolerate Montgomery's insubordination, and find ways to work around Montgomery's obstruction. But there were limits to what any commander, no matter how diplomatic, could tolerate. And Montgomery, blinded by his own ego, kept pushing past those limits. Montgomery's relationship with Eisenhower and other Allied commanders followed a consistent, maddening pattern. Montgomery would demand massive resources for his operations, receive those resources, fail to achieve his objectives, blame everyone else for the failure, and then immediately demand even more resources for his next plan. This cycle reached a tragic peak in September 1944 with Operation Market Garden. Montgomery proposed a daring, uncharacteristic plan: drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in the Netherlands to capture a series of bridges, creating a carpet through which British armored forces could drive straight into the industrial heart of Germany. Montgomery promised, with his usual absolute certainty, that this would end the war by Christmas 1944. Eisenhower had serious doubts. Intelligence reports indicated stronger German resistance in the area than Montgomery acknowledged, specifically the presence of SS Panzer divisions refitting in the area. The plan relied on capturing and holding a single, narrow highway while surrounded by enemy forces. If any one bridge wasn't captured quickly, the entire operation would fail. It was a house of cards. But Montgomery insisted. He argued that a concentrated thrust into Germany, under British command, a pencil-like thrust, was superior to Eisenhower's broad front strategy, which spread supplies across the whole line. He said he needed absolute priority for fuel and ammunition. He threatened to appeal to Churchill if Eisenhower didn't approve. Under immense pressure to finish the war quickly, Eisenhower approved the operation. He diverted precious supplies from American armies to support Montgomery. 3 elite American airborne divisions were placed under Montgomery's command. The entire Allied Air Force was dedicated to supporting Market Garden for over a week, leaving other sectors vulnerable. By September 25th, Market Garden had collapsed in ruins. It was a catastrophe. Over 17,000 Allied casualties were sustained. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force at Arnhem, the bridge too far, and the war would absolutely not end by Christmas. Montgomery's response to this disaster was textbook narcissism. He blamed everyone except himself. He blamed the weather for delaying air support. He blamed American generals for not sending enough supplies fast enough. He blamed intelligence officers for not predicting German strength accurately. He even blamed the Dutch resistance for providing inadequate information. What Montgomery didn't do was accept responsibility for designing an overly complex operation that put 3 divisions into an untenable position. He didn't acknowledge that his promise of ending the war by Christmas had been an unrealistic fantasy. He didn't apologize to the families of the 17,000 men who died or were captured. Instead, Montgomery immediately began planning his next operation and demanding resources for it. He wanted priority for supplies to cross the Rhine River. He wanted American divisions transferred to his command. He wanted Eisenhower to abandon the broad front strategy entirely and concentrate all forces under Montgomery's direction for a single thrust into Germany. Eisenhower refused. The broad front strategy would continue. Multiple armies would advance into Germany along different routes, stressing the German defenses everywhere and preventing them from concentrating their forces at a single point. Montgomery would command his sector, but he wouldn't control American armies or receive unlimited resources. Montgomery protested to Churchill. He wrote letters questioning Eisenhower's competence to the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He gave interviews suggesting that British military experience was superior to American enthusiasm. He positioned himself as the prophet warning against strategic mistakes that would prolong the war. And Eisenhower tolerated this constant undermining because firing Montgomery would create an international incident. So he worked around Montgomery, gave him enough resources to keep Churchill satisfied, and tried to minimize the damage Montgomery's ego and ambition could cause. Then came December 1944, and the German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. On December the 16th, 1944, out of the freezing mists of the Ardennes, Germany launched its last major offensive of the war in Western Europe. Over 200,000 German troops, spearheaded by elite SS Panzer divisions, attacked through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, hitting a weakly defended sector of the American line held by tired and inexperienced troops. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise, broke through American positions, and created a massive bulge in the Allied front line that gave the battle its name. The attack was Hitler's desperate gamble. His goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital supply port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace, leaving Germany free to fight the Soviets. It had almost no chance of succeeding strategically, but it could buy Germany time and inflict heavy casualties on the Allies. American forces in the Ardennes were caught off guard, but fought desperately to slow the German advance. Small units held crossroads against tank battalions. The 101st Airborne Division rushed to the critical road junction at Bastogne and held it despite being completely surrounded and outnumbered. Other American units conducted fighting retreats, blowing bridges and establishing new defensive lines. Eisenhower reacted with remarkable speed. He recognized the danger immediately. He sent the elite 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to hold key positions. He redirected Patton's Third Army to attack the German flank from the south, a maneuver of incredible logistical difficulty, involving turning an entire army 90 degrees in the snow. He pulled divisions from quiet sectors and rushed them to the battle area. Within days, American forces had stabilized the situation and began counterattacking. However, the German offensive had physically split the American forces into two groups, creating severe communication difficulties between the northern and southern shoulders of the bulge. Eisenhower made a practical, pragmatic decision to place the American 1st and 9th Armies temporarily under Montgomery's command, simply because they were operating on the northern side of the breach, and Montgomery's headquarters was closer and had better communications. This was meant to be a temporary operational expedient, a fix for the heat of battle. Montgomery would coordinate the defense in the northern sector, while American generals like Bradley and Patton handled the southern counterattack. Once the German offensive was stopped and communication restored, command arrangements would return to normal. Montgomery, however, took this temporary arrangement as validation of his strategic vision. He interpreted it as Eisenhower finally admitting that British command was superior to American. He started treating the American armies under his temporary command as if they were permanently his forces. He began lecturing American generals on tactics. The Battle of the Bulge was stopped by American troops. The 101st held Bastogne against impossible odds, replying to a German surrender demand with the famous single word, nuts. Patton's Third Army relieved them in a remarkable winter offensive that defied military textbooks. American soldiers fought in brutal cold without adequate winter clothing, stopping the German advance through sheer determination and sacrifice. By early January 1945, the German offensive had failed completely. American forces had eliminated the bulge and restored the front line. The cost was staggering, over 80,000 American casualties. But the Germans had lost even more and had exhausted their remaining reserves. The war would continue on its inexorable path toward German defeat. Montgomery's role had been to coordinate the northern sector defense. He did this competently, but not brilliantly. He was cautious, perhaps too cautious, waiting to counterattack until everything was perfect. The American divisions under his temporary command did most of the actual fighting. Montgomery's main contribution was ensuring they received supplies and coordinating their positions. But Montgomery saw the Battle of the Bulge as his personal victory. He believed he had saved the Americans from their own mistakes. And on January 7th, 1945, he decided to tell the world exactly what he thought had happened. Montgomery scheduled a press conference for January 7th, 1945, to discuss the Battle of the Bulge. His own staff, sensing the danger, advised against it. The battle had just ended. Emotions were raw. American soldiers had done 95% of the fighting and dying. This wasn't the time for Montgomery to claim credit. But Montgomery ignored the advice. He believed the world needed to understand the truth. And the truth, according to Montgomery, was that British command had rescued Americans from disaster. The press conference began with Montgomery describing how he had taken command in the northern sector. He said he had found the situation confused, with American units scattered and disorganized. He painted a picture of chaos that needed British expertise to resolve. Montgomery claimed he had immediately seen what needed to be done. He had positioned forces properly, established clear command relationships, and organized the defense that stopped the German advance. He made it sound like American generals had been overwhelmed, and British calm had saved the day. He used phrases like, "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies," and spoke about how he had headed off German attacks. He described American commanders in patronizing terms, suggesting they were brave but inexperienced men who needed guidance from veteran British leadership. The worst part was how Montgomery described the American soldiers. He praised their courage, but implied they had been badly led. He suggested that, without British intervention, American casualties would have been even higher, and the German breakthrough might have succeeded. Montgomery concluded by discussing future strategy. He argued again for a concentrated thrust under unified command, implying that Eisenhower's broad front strategy had created the conditions for the German attack in the first place. He positioned himself as the prophet who had warned against dispersing forces, and who now offered the only solution for victory. The press conference was a diplomatic disaster of epic proportions. British reporters saw it as Montgomery being honest about British contributions. American reporters saw it as Montgomery stealing credit and insulting American soldiers who had bled in the snow to stop the German offensive. The story went out immediately via wire services. American newspapers reported that Montgomery claimed to have saved the U.S. Army. Editorial writers expressed outrage. Veterans organizations demanded explanations. Members of Congress asked why a British general was allowed to disparage American troops who were supplying the bulk of the war effort. But the most dangerous reaction came from Eisenhower's senior American commanders. They were livid. They had watched their soldiers die in the snow at Bastogne and in the Ardennes forests. They had coordinated the complex counteroffensive that crushed the German attack. And now Montgomery was taking credit for their victory while implying they were incompetent. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, a mild-mannered man known as the GI's general, was so angry he could barely speak. General George Patton, who had turned his entire 3rd Army 90 degrees and attacked into the German flank in one of the war's most impressive maneuvers, called Montgomery's statement an ungracious insult. And both of them were about to tell Eisenhower that they would resign, rather than continue serving under an Allied commander who wouldn't protect American honor from British arrogance. On January 9th, 1945, 2 days after Montgomery's press conference, General Omar Bradley walked into Eisenhower's headquarters. The atmosphere was grim. Bradley told Eisenhower something that made Eisenhower's blood run cold. Bradley said that if Montgomery wasn't removed from command, Bradley would resign his commission, and if Bradley resigned, Patton would resign with him. This wasn't a threat. This was a statement of fact. Bradley explained that he could not continue to command American armies while a British officer publicly humiliated American soldiers and claimed credit for American victories. His officers were furious. His soldiers felt betrayed. The entire American chain of command was on the edge of mutiny. Bradley had been Eisenhower's classmate at West Point. He was calm, methodical, professional. He didn't make dramatic gestures or emotional demands. When Bradley said he would resign, he meant it. He had calculated that his duty to American soldiers outweighed his duty to maintain alliance harmony. Patton reinforced Bradley's position. Patton had driven his Third Army through a winter storm to relieve Bastogne. His soldiers had fought in temperatures below zero without adequate winter gear. They had performed one of the war's most remarkable maneuvers. And Montgomery had just told the world press that American forces needed British rescue. Patton put it bluntly to Eisenhower. Montgomery's press conference was an insult that could not be tolerated. American soldiers wouldn't fight effectively under commanders who allowed them to be slandered. The alliance might be important, but so was American pride and American honor. Something had to give. Eisenhower understood immediately what was happening. His two senior field commanders, the men who led millions of American soldiers, were telling him they would rather end their careers than serve under current conditions. If they resigned, other American generals would follow. The American army would effectively rebel against the Allied command structure. This put Eisenhower in an impossible position. If he sided with Bradley and Patton, he would have to fire Montgomery, which would outrage Churchill and possibly fracture the alliance. If he sided with Montgomery and refused to act, Bradley and Patton would resign, which would fracture the American command structure and possibly force Eisenhower's own removal. Eisenhower tried to find a middle ground. He could issue a statement clarifying American contributions to the Battle of the Bulge victory. He could privately reprimand Montgomery. He could ensure future command arrangements kept Montgomery away from American forces. Bradley and Patton said that wasn't enough. Montgomery had publicly humiliated American soldiers. A quiet rebuke wouldn't satisfy anyone. Montgomery needed to be removed from command, or at minimum removed from any authority over American forces. Anything less would be unacceptable. Eisenhower asked for time to think. He told Bradley and Patton not to do anything precipitous while he considered options. Both generals agreed to wait, but made clear their patience was limited. They wanted Montgomery gone, and they wanted it done quickly. After Bradley and Patton left, Eisenhower sat alone in his office and faced the hardest decision of his command. He had the authority to fire Montgomery. As Supreme Allied Commander, he could relieve any subordinate for insubordination or for conduct detrimental to the alliance. Montgomery's press conference clearly qualified. Eisenhower began drafting the order. He would relieve Montgomery of command, citing the press conference as conduct that damaged alliance unity and undermined confidence in the Allied command structure. He would send Montgomery home and reorganize the British forces under a different commander, perhaps Alexander. The order sat on his desk. All it needed was his signature. Once signed, it would go out immediately to all commands. Montgomery would be removed. Bradley and Patton would be satisfied. American honor would be protected. But before Eisenhower could sign, the phone rang. It was the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff calling from London with an urgent message from Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill had learned about the crisis within hours of Montgomery's press conference. British intelligence monitored American military communications and quickly reported that senior American generals were demanding Montgomery's removal. Churchill understood immediately that this could destroy the alliance he had worked so hard to maintain since 1940. Churchill called Eisenhower directly. The conversation was tense but civil. Churchill said he understood American anger about the press conference. He acknowledged that Montgomery had been tactless and that the statement could be interpreted as insulting to American forces. But Churchill argued that firing Montgomery would create problems far worse than the press conference. Montgomery was Britain's most visible military leader. Removing him would be seen as America forcing Britain to sacrifice its best general to satisfy American pride. British public opinion would turn against the alliance. Churchill made clear that if Eisenhower fired Montgomery, he would have no choice but to defend Montgomery publicly. He would have to tell the British people that Montgomery was removed despite his battlefield successes. He would have to explain that American political pressure overrode military merit. This would damage Anglo-American relations badly, perhaps irreparably. Eisenhower listened and then made his own position clear. American generals were ready to resign. American soldiers felt insulted. The American public was outraged. Eisenhower couldn't ignore these pressures any more than Churchill could ignore British opinion. Something had to change. The status quo was untenable. Churchill proposed a solution. What if Montgomery apologized? Not a public apology that would humiliate him, but a private letter to Eisenhower and to American commanders, acknowledging that the press conference had been misinterpreted and expressing regret for any offense given. Would that satisfy American honor while avoiding the political crisis that firing Montgomery would create? Eisenhower said he would consult with Bradley and Patton. He couldn't promise the apology would be enough. Montgomery had crossed the line and trust was broken, but he would present Churchill's proposal to the American commanders and see if they would accept it. After hanging up with Churchill, Eisenhower called in his chief of staff and explained the situation. The draft order relieving Montgomery still sat on the desk. Eisenhower hadn't signed it yet, but he hadn't canceled it either. He was waiting to see if Churchill's solution could work. But Churchill had one more move to make. He contacted Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Francis de Guingand, a man known for his diplomacy and ability to manage Montgomery's moods, and told him to fly to Montgomery's headquarters immediately. De Guingand needed to make Montgomery understand how close he was to being fired, and he needed to convince Montgomery to write the apology that might save his career. Major General Francis de Guingand arrived at Montgomery's headquarters on January 10th with an urgent message. The weather was foul, matching the gravity of the situation. Montgomery greeted him casually, almost cheerfully, completely unaware of the crisis he had ignited. Montgomery thought the press conference had been successful. He believed he had finally gotten proper credit for British contributions to the war. He was living in a bubble of his own making. De Guingand told Montgomery the brutal truth. Eisenhower had drafted an order relieving Montgomery of all commands. The order was written and ready to be signed. The only reason Montgomery still had a job was that Eisenhower was giving him one last, slim chance to fix the situation. Montgomery was stunned. He genuinely didn't understand what he had done wrong. He sputtered, confused. Had he not spoken the truth? Had he not saved the Americans? Montgomery tried one more argument. What about his position? What about British prestige? How could he apologize when he had only stated facts? De Guingand cut him off. Montgomery's position didn't matter. British prestige didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was preventing the alliance from fracturing over Montgomery's ego. De Guingand made the stakes absolutely clear. If Montgomery didn't write the apology immediately, Eisenhower would sign the relief order. Montgomery would be sent home in disgrace. His career would end. And the British press would learn that he was fired not for military failure, but because he couldn't control his mouth and had alienated every American general in Europe. Alternatively, Montgomery could write a gracious letter expressing regret, acknowledge that the press conference had been misunderstood, and promise better coordination with American commanders in the future. This would allow everyone to move forward. Montgomery would keep his command. The alliance would survive. And Montgomery might actually learn something about diplomacy. Montgomery listened with growing realization. De Guingand was his most loyal subordinate and closest friend. If Freddie said Montgomery was about to be fired, it was true. If he said the only solution was an apology, there was no alternative. The reality pierced Montgomery's armor of arrogance. Montgomery sat down and began writing. The letter was difficult for him. He had never been good at admitting mistakes or accepting criticism. His entire career had been built on absolute confidence in his own judgment. Apologizing felt like surrendering his principles. But de Guingand stood over him and edited every line. The letter had to be sincere, had to acknowledge American sensitivities, and had to give Eisenhower a way to accept it without losing face. After several drafts, Montgomery produced a letter that de Guingand approved. The letter expressed deep regret that the press conference had caused misunderstanding. Montgomery acknowledged that his remarks might have been interpreted as failing to give proper credit to American forces. He praised the courage and determination of American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. He pledged full cooperation with Eisenhower and American commanders going forward. It wasn't a full apology. Montgomery didn't explicitly admit he was wrong, but it was enough to give Eisenhower what he needed, a public acknowledgement from Montgomery that the press conference had been a mistake and a commitment to better behavior in the future. De Guingand took the letter and flew immediately back to Eisenhower's headquarters, battling the winter storms. He delivered it personally and urged Eisenhower to accept it. The alliance needed this crisis to end. Both American and British forces needed their commanders focused on defeating Germany, not fighting each other. Eisenhower read the letter. He showed it to Bradley and Patton. The question now was whether this carefully worded semi-apology would satisfy the American generals who had demanded Montgomery's removal. Eisenhower called Bradley and Patton to his headquarters and showed them Montgomery's letter. He asked them directly whether this was sufficient or whether they still insisted on Montgomery's removal. The relief order was still on his desk, a silent testament to how close they were to the brink. He could sign it if they wanted. Bradley read the letter carefully. He noted what Montgomery had said and what he hadn't said. Montgomery expressed regret for misunderstanding, but didn't admit the press conference was wrong. He praised American soldiers, but didn't retract his claims about British command saving the situation. It was a politician's apology, carefully worded to give something without admitting anything. Patton was more blunt. He said the letter was garbage, that Montgomery was still claiming he saved the Americans while pretending to apologize. Patton wanted Montgomery fired regardless of political consequences. American soldiers deserved better than this face-saving exercise. He paced the room, his anger palpable. But Bradley was more pragmatic. He recognized the political reality Eisenhower faced. Firing Montgomery would create an enormous crisis with Churchill and the British government. It might damage the alliance at a critical moment in the war. The letter, inadequate as it was, gave Eisenhower something to work with. Bradley told Eisenhower that he would accept the apology on one condition. Montgomery had to understand that his temporary command of American forces during the Bulge was over. American armies would return to American command immediately. Montgomery would have no authority over American troops going forward. If Eisenhower could ensure that, Bradley would withdraw his resignation threat. Patton reluctantly agreed. He didn't like it. He thought Montgomery deserved to be fired. But he recognized that Bradley was giving Eisenhower a way out of an impossible situation. Patton would go along with it, but he made clear he never wanted to serve under Montgomery's command again. Eisenhower took the relief order from his desk and tore it up. The sound of tearing paper was the only sound in the room. He told Bradley and Patton that American forces would return to American command immediately. Montgomery would have no operational authority over American armies. Future strategy would be decided by Eisenhower with input from American commanders, and Montgomery would have to accept those decisions without appeal to Churchill. Eisenhower then called Montgomery and accepted the apology. The conversation was cold and professional. Eisenhower made clear that Montgomery's behavior had damaged trust, and that future cooperation would be strictly limited to military necessity. Montgomery's days of having Churchill's backing for strategic arguments were over. Montgomery tried to defend himself, tried to explain that the press conference had been misunderstood. Eisenhower cut him off. The discussion was closed. Montgomery had apologized. Eisenhower had accepted, and now they would both move forward with winning the war. Anything else Montgomery wanted to say, he could save for his memoirs. The crisis was over. Montgomery remained in command. Bradley and Patton withdrew their resignation threats. The alliance survived. But something fundamental had changed in the command relationships. Eisenhower had learned that Montgomery's political protection had limits. Churchill would defend Montgomery up to a point, but even Churchill couldn't protect Montgomery from consequences if Montgomery pushed too far. And Montgomery had come within one signature of being fired. Montgomery had learned that his military reputation didn't make him untouchable. Eisenhower had been willing to fire him despite political consequences. Only Churchill's intervention and a warning from his own chief of staff had saved Montgomery's career. He would never again have quite the same confidence that his position was secure. But the cost of keeping Montgomery was significant. American generals had lost respect for the Allied command structure. They had seen Eisenhower forced to accept an inadequate apology because firing Montgomery would be politically difficult. This created resentment that would affect operations for the rest of the war. And the fundamental problem remained. Eisenhower still had a subordinate he couldn't trust, couldn't control, and couldn't remove without creating a political crisis. The war would continue with this weakness built into the Allied command structure. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery accepted the surrender in his sector and posed for the cameras, looking every bit the conquering hero. British newspapers celebrated him as the architect of victory. To the public, the alliance looked perfect. Behind closed doors, the truth was different. Eisenhower gave Montgomery public credit, but privately, he was relieved he would never have to command him again. Montgomery went to his grave, believing his strategic vision had been correct all along. He wrote memoirs claiming that if Eisenhower had only listened to him, the war would have ended in 1944. History proved otherwise. German generals interviewed after the war confirmed that Eisenhower's broad front strategy prevented them from concentrating their defenses. Military historians concluded that Montgomery's single-thrust proposals were logistically impossible. The single road to Arnhem proved that a narrow front was a death trap. Eisenhower had been right about strategy, but he'd been trapped when it came to personnel. So, why couldn't Eisenhower fire Montgomery when the order was sitting on his desk, just one signature away? Because the political cost was too high. Churchill would have fought it. The alliance might have fractured. The Cold War partnership could have been damaged before it began. Eisenhower chose alliance unity over American honor. He chose to manage the problem instead of solving it. He tore up the relief order and focused on winning the war despite Montgomery, not because of him. Whether that was wisdom or weakness depends on what you think matters more: winning the political game or standing up for your people when they've been insulted. 6 years later, President Harry Truman would fire General Douglas MacArthur for insubordination, proving that sometimes a general can be removed regardless of the political cost. Eisenhower made the opposite calculation. Different wars, different choices. The alliance survived. Germany was defeated. Montgomery kept his command and his fame, and Eisenhower lived with the decision he'd made. Eisenhower couldn't fire Montgomery, and in the end, he chose not to.